Hi, I'm Matt, and I'm an analyst here at Capitalize. Today we're going to be talking about pivoting data in Alteryx. There's a couple different tools that we can use to pivot data in Alteryx, the first being the Transpose tool, and the other one being the Crosstab. Pivoting or changing the layout of data can be useful in a couple different scenarios. One of those being changing column headers to data values, and another one being changing the format of the data so it can be used in another tool, such as a formula or summarize tool. There's a lot of other applications of these tools, but those are just two examples. At the simplest level, the Transpose tool will take horizontal data and make it vertical, whereas the Crosstab tool will take vertical data and make it horizontal. In order to use these tools, it is key to understand what you want your data to look like after it goes through the tool and to understand the different tool configuration options. The options can definitely be confusing at first, but once you have a good understanding, these tools can become your new best friend. Now we're going to take a look at a simple transpose example. On the left here, we have our configuration within Alteryx. In the middle is our data before it goes to the transpose tool. And on the right here is our data after it goes to the transpose tool. As we said before, the transpose tool pivots the data so that a wide data set will become a narrower data set. Or in other words, horizontal data will become vertical. The transpose tool will always create more data than you started with, and the number of output rows will be the number of columns times the number of rows in your input data set. So for this one, we have the 4 columns and the 3 rows, and so our output will be 12 different rows. Now we need to take a look at the configuration. So first, we have the option to configure the key columns. Key columns are columns that will keep the same values, orientation, and header value, but each value will be duplicated for each of the data columns. And then we have the option for data columns. The data columns will be pivoted into 2 different output columns, the name and the value. No matter how many columns we select in our data columns, they will all be put into the same 2 name and value columns. The name column will consist of the header names that you selected, and the value columns will be the values of those selected data headers. And now you may be wondering how it puts these and in which order. So we'll go over a quick example here. So first we see the first manager, Matt, and then we take the value from our first data column, which is Q1. We're going to take that value, put it over here, and then take the value where those intersect, which for this is 501, and we're going to put that in the value column. Then it'll move on to the next data column, which will be Q2, and then it'll grab this value 515 and put it there in the value column. This is going to continue down for all the data columns for the first manager, and then it'll move on to the next one, which will be Dave. And then as we see, Dave will have 4 columns as well, 1 for each one of the quarters, and then all the values here will be pivoted to the values here. If I had more columns in my input data and I did not select them in either my key columns or my data columns, that column will be dropped. And we'll see an example of that in the later transpose example. Now that we have an understanding of the transpose tool, let's take a closer look at how the Crosstab tool works. The Crosstab tool is basically going to be the opposite of the transpose tool. It's going to take a narrow data set and make it wider, or in other words, take a vertical data set and make it horizontal. The Crosstab tool tends to be more confusing than the Transpose tool. While the Transpose tool will create a pattern in the data, creating duplicates of items and pivoting the data, the Crosstab tool needs a pattern in order to correctly aggregate the data. The goal of the Crosstab tool is to sort the data into appropriate columns and rows and aggregate or concatenate specified data value. It is important to know the end goal and the end data structure that you're going for in order to correctly configure the Crosstab tool. Now that we have a general understanding of what it does, let's take a look at the configuration within Alteryx. The first thing you'll need to do is specify a group by value. Now, you don't need to specify any group by values, but whatever you specify, it will turn into the rows of the Crosstab. So here, I have specified the location column, and as we can see in the location column, I have 2 values repeated. I have Denver and Chicago. And then we can see once it goes to the Crosstab tool, these will become the rows. We have 1 row for Chicago and 1 row for Denver. Whenever you're specifying a group by data, it's going to group by each unique value in that column. The same sort of thing happens for the column headers. The column headers is also going to take each unique value, but it's going to do it for each of the aggregation methods. So here we have specified sum and average for our aggregation measures. So we're going to have each unique value in department for sum and each unique value in department for average. So if we come up to our output data, we can see we have sum of home goods, average home goods, sum of sporting goods, and average sporting goods. And then in my department, we have two unique values, sporting goods and home goods. Once I've established which column I want as my new headers, we need to select the values for aggregation. And so here I'm going to take my sales numbers and I'm going to use that as my value for aggregation. And then it's going to apply a sum and average. And then if we take a look here, we can see the sum of home goods in Chicago is going to be this value, and the sum of home goods in Denver is going to be this value. Now that we have a good understanding of the simple usage of the Transpose and Crosstab tools, let's dive into a little more involved example within Alteryx. To start out, I'm going to come over to my input-output data category, and I'm going to drag in an input data tool. Once I drag this in, I'm going to navigate to where my file lives and then bring in sheet 1 there. I'm going to press run so we can get a preview of our data down in the results window. And once I click on this output data anchor, we're now going to see all our data present. At its core, this spreadsheet contains sales information for different products. As we can see here in the product column, we have 10 different products listed out. And then we also have some categorical information, such as the sales category, as well as an age range for that product. And then we can see our sales data is spread out into 12 different columns, one for each month. Now, our goal will be to pivot this data so we have an average and sum of sales for each category and age range. To do this, it will take a few different steps. You can probably guess the steps. The first will be to transpose the data so we get all the sales data in the same column with duplicated values for category and age range. And the second step will be to do a crosstab, where we will group by the age range, make the header each category, and then aggregate the sales by average and total for both the category and the age range. So to start out, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to grab my transpose tool. I'm going to drag that down on my canvas, make sure it's connected to that input data tool, and then we can dive into our configuration for the transpose. Now, if you remember, our key columns are the ones that it's going to maintain the header value, the value of the cells, as well as the orientation. The values that I want to keep consistent from the input to the output are going to be the category and the suggested age range. So I'm going to go ahead and select those in my key columns. Next, we need to figure out what our data columns are. I don't care about product information, so I'm going to unselect that field, and I also don't care about this average monthly sales. We're going to do the aggregation at the end at a different level, so it doesn't make sense to bring this field through. Now I'm just going to scroll down to make sure all the other fields are selected, and as we can see, we have January through December selected. Now I can run this, and then we can see the output of the transpose tool. So initially, we have our input data file here, and then if I click on the output anchor, we can see that data is now pivoted. Hopping back to the input, we can see we have our 12 data values as each month, and then we have 10 different rows for the 10 different products. And then coming to the output, we can see we have 120 records, and that's just the result of those 10 rows and the 12 columns. And as we said before, if you just multiply those together, you can get the expected number of output rows. If I open up Excel here, we can look at a more visual representation of what's going on. So you can see here that the blue is going to be my key columns. So I selected category and suggested age range. And then we can see over here that those persist in the same orientation, the same values. It's just that those values are going to be duplicated. And then we can find our data columns. And then this will be our data column header, and that'll turn into the name field, and then our values are put into the value field. And then we can see here, if we have general at age 13 plus for January, this will be our value, and then we can see that value represented over here for general 13 plus January. Now that we've made our transpose tool, we're going to need to drag in the crosstab tool to do the aggregation. So now I'm going to come over to the transform category, grab the crosstab tool, and drag that in after the transpose. And now we need to specify what we want to group by, what our headers are going to be, our new values, and then how we want to aggregate those different values. So first of all, my group by value, I would like to make suggested age range. And then for the column headers, this will be the other value I want to group by. And for me, I want that to be category. Next, we must specify our values, and then we're going to select just the value column here. And you'll notice once I selected value, the methods of aggregation changed, and this is just due to the data type. So because my value is a numeric data type, I'm going to get these options for summing, averaging, counting, and doing different percentage calculations. If I change this back to a string field, we're just going to have the options to concatenate or grab the first and last. But for now, I want the value, and then because that is a numeric value, I'm going to do the sum and the average. And now once I have this configuration where I want it, I can press run, and we can see the output from the crosstab tool. First, I'm going to select the input anchor. We can view what it looked like after it went through the transpose. And now we can view it within the crosstab. So we can see here, we grouped by each of our age ranges. And then we also grouped by each of our categories. And then we did a sum and an average for each one of those categories we grouped by. And now you'll notice there are some null fields. And this can be concerning, but if we go back and look at our data, we have a null for educational 13 plus, and we don't have any of those in our input data here. So it makes sense why those values would be null. Hopping back to Excel, we can again look at the more visual representation of the crosstab, and we can see here that we made category our header field. And we can see we grouped by this value, so it's only one of each. And then we also grouped by our suggested age range. So we can see only one of each value there. And then these were all the values that we aggregated and which came down into the data values. To conclude, the transpose and crosstab tools are going to be used to pivot data within Alteryx. And again, pivoting data is something that you'll find very handy and something that you'll end up doing the more you use Alteryx. The sooner you can become comfortable with these tools, the sooner you'll become an expert data scientist.